Hello, listeners. Welcome to another interesting episode of Financially Speaking, powered by India First Life. I am Sunder Natarajan, and I'm currently the Chief Risk Officer at India First Life, and I am your host for today. As we come close to the end of this financial year, most of you would be trying to stretch the hours in the day in a bit to complete your annual goals at your workplace. You could be working in an organization or running your own business. The race could be annual targets or the proverbial project which has to get met before the year ends. At this juncture, an interesting question comes to my mind. How many of you are equally concerned about implementing your personal financial plan and are working on the plan for the year ahead as well? Have you furnished proof of investments to your HR department? Have you reimbursed all your expenses for the year? Have you revisited your goal for next year and aligned it to your long-term goal? In other words, do you have a well thought out personal financial plan for next year? If your answer is yes, take a bow. You are amongst the select few. If your answer is a no, you may want to step back and ponder. Does it not make sense? What risks are you exposed to depending on your answer? This brings us to the topic of today's podcast: assessment and management of personal financial risks at various life stages. Our guest for today's podcast is someone who's been investing in the stock market for donkey's years, right from when he was in college. You name an investment and he's probably dabbled in it and most definitely has a view on it. He's lived and worked in about 10 countries and has made investment in a variety of markets. He did a CA and an MBA from Ross Business School and London Business School. And at the age of 40, when he was a CFO of a multilateral bank managing Asia, he decided to do something different with his life and took a sabbatical. During this period, he could not keep his hands off investing. And seeing this, a few of his friends requested him to manage the portfolio. Both the sabbatical and managing the portfolio has continued for a decade, and he's now a partner with Banconus, a wealth management company, and a partner with Alchemy, a leadership coach and consulting firm. He's also on the board of two charities, and he does a variety of other stuff: blogging, traveling, sports, movie buff, you name it, and he indulges. India First is delighted to welcome Ramkey Ananthakrishnan to our podcast. Ramkey, I hope I did justice to your profile, and I'm sure you can do a better job at speaking about your passions. So over to you.
Good morning to your listeners and to you as well, Sundar. I think it's tough to beat the intro you've done, so thank you for the very kind words. As I just to a couple of points to as to the reason how this came about is how I came with what I call my life motto. So 20 years of learning, 20 years of learning and earning, 20 years of returning, learning and earning, with
Wow.
anything beyond 60 being a bonus. So, so
Sorry, can
again,
you repeat the last one? Can you repeat the last bit? I got the 20 years of learning, 20 years of learning and earning, and then 20 years of.
returning, learning, and earning,
Wow.
and beyond 60 being a bonus. Maybe when we get there, I'll start thinking about the next 20. And so that's kind of what drove me to take a break at my 40 with very little idea about what I want to do with the rest of my life, which was also very interesting considering up till then I was always been a planner. I always had the long game. It was that juxtaposition was a little, let's say, different. Uh, and so one thing led to the other. And so when I was in the third phase, which is where I am now, which is returning, learning, and earning, uh, brought me to the stuff that you already introduced, where I'm in the leadership coach. And today's conversation is about the financial advisory work. Before we get into, if I may, before we get into talking about the what's of financial planning and the risk that you mentioned in your introduction, I think the why I do it is probably an important topic that I wanted to just address here. you know, like many of us in our lives, we all can do many things, but we somehow end up doing one or two things in our lives, right? So similarly, the why I do this comes about from my own background. So I come from a very low middle class family. My family went through its own trials and tribulations, with my dad losing his right arm in an accident just when he was in his 30s, and I was just about, I think, 6 or 8 years old. And we went through a lot of financial tumult at one point of time, though we were unaware as children. Another learning about how, I guess, financial discussions are kept only at the adult space. So we weren't aware, but at that one point in our lives, our total net worth was just about 10,000 rupees. To put it in numbers, it's only about what at that time, maybe a 5 months expense or maybe 4 months expense. And then from there on, fast forward, I was able to quit a fledgling career when I was 40 and do completely, life changing things with myself. So if I could do it, I always wondered, how do I enable something similar, where you have the freedom to pursue what you want to do with money fueling that passion or that flight. That's what brought about my current, let's say, roles of what I do. So I hope that helps add color to why I'm here, Sundar.
Absolutely, Ramki. It does. It makes me, now that you talk about it, makes me think about my college days. I used to get pocket money. I remember, it's pretty little unique. I got pocket money of $100 in my first year of BCom, second, $200 in second year, and 300 in third year. Okay, so some arithmetic progression there. But the interesting thing is the money would vanish in the first week, and the next 3 weeks would be a frugal existence until I became a rich kid again. Then this continued when I went to hostel while doing B school. Okay, a little more of pocket money, but the story continues. 1:3 continued. Then when I got a job and started getting a salary, I was staying with my parents, and hence was saved from all the responsibility of running a household. It never struck me to make a financial plan until I started living on my own. Now, when I got married, some bit of discipline came in life, but still no financial plan. Responsibility found its way only when we came to know that we were going to be parents. Suddenly we realized that we needed a house of our own. We needed a plan for life. They say that hindsight is cliched, right? So, Ramki, I guess my story represents the average Joe. What do you think that I could have done better? What kind of financial planning could I have done earlier?
Right. I think your story should resonate with many of our listeners, right? I mean, we all, when we have a little something in our hands, we somehow feel very rich. And if we don't have a clear plan, we somehow blow through it. So it's a very natural thing that because it's something that just comes with us. So it's a story that I see as a planner today, and it easily resonates with me, having been in those same college shoes as well, Sundar. So when I think about one of the stories that comes to my mind as a child story is the story of the tortoise and the hare, right? All of us know the story of the race between the tortoise and the hare. And I also think this has some lessons to our financial life as well, right? So if you take the example you gave, you're very kind to share your story. It's very similar. Most of us, ask ourselves, ask these questions, right? Are your parents put you through college with very little plan or money. If they can do it, why can't I do it? Or questions like, I'm only 30, I'm healthy, I don't smoke, I don't drink, I'm also vegan or vegetarian or whatever is. I also do diet and do properly. I'm very healthy. Why do I need health insurance? Or retirement? Arey yaar, I've just started working. Why do I need a plan to retire? वो तो कल की बात है. So we'll think about that tomorrow. So this is when we get to that problem, some solution the world will conspire to create, or hey, I will do some jugaad and I will get to that. And so that is probably what most people are doing, which is kind of quite sad, right? However, I also say if we were to be a tortoise in this and start very early, do very boring stuff, which is put away some percentage of money, and we'll discuss that in detail, and start very early, even in our 20s, or if we can, from our first salary. Let's say in your own example, with that $100, if you had to take away 10 rupees, you could have easily afforded that and put it away. What investments and stuff we'll talk about later. Then perhaps that learning, as you got 200, would have been 20 rupees, that 300 would have been 30. And that habit itself would have enabled preparation for the future. Could have happened, but again, it's something that we are not taught. And in our education system, I just wish that we are able to teach this early, to be a tortoise and be steady and boring, rather than just be the 100-meter Hussein Bolt hare. So that's how I kind of think about it, and it resonates very well, Sundar.
Awesome, Ramki. I'm sure you have a bunch of happy tortoise customers. So speaking about your customers and the wealth advisory services that you offer, what does this entail? Do you follow a standardized approach, or is it a customized one?
Right, that's an interesting question, right? So let me ask you a question, if I may, personal one to you, Sundar.
Sure.
Do you have children, Sundar?
Yeah, I have a 20-year-old daughter and a 12-year-old son.
Oh, congratulations. So I'm sure they come to you. I know parents. I also have three children, and they usually take advice from the others than their dads. But again, in this case, let's say they come to you for an advice on what career should I do or what sports should I take. Do you give them the same advice, saying, "Hey, you should be a doctor. You should be a doctor," or something like that?
No, I will probably ask them a few questions and
Ah,
assess their interest, and then yeah, you know the rest.
yeah. So there you go. So I think that's an interesting point. The first question before you tell them what to do is you're going to ask them some questions. How nice. So when I look at, if I translate this to the question you asked, which is, do you follow a standardized, or how do we customize it? The answer is, if an analogy comes to my mind, let's say Ramki, and my wife go to the hospital, and the lady walks up in the front at the reception and says, "Hello, hello," and then she hands me something. And I said, "What is this?" And so she says, "Sir, medicine." And I'm a little astounded. I'm sitting and saying, "Hold on, I haven't met the doctor. You don't know what I have is a disease, but you're giving me a medicine?" And the lady responds and says, "Sir, for today, this is the medicine. आज के लिए यही दवाई है." Imagine if this is how we were to do medicines. How would patients be, right? I'm sure Twitter will go mad. Patients will have a strike and stuff. Clearly, we don't do that with medicines. But somehow in the financial services field, we believe I noticed when I move anywhere, as I was investing, as relationship managers or others would come and approach me, is, I have a product to sell, are you interested in buying? You know what I mean? And that's the position that needs to really shift. And so some of the areas which has been happening in the last many years now is also where customization becomes very key. Just like you would be very aghast if this experience were to happen to anyone in a hospital, Twitter would go crazy, and people will start striking. So similarly, I also believe that customization is very, very key in our investments, right? No two children are similar, no two siblings are similar, no two patient are similar. Similarly, we have to really think about customizing. So what does customizing mean? Right? So that's obviously the next question. Customization of any investment solutions, in our opinion, should be around four pillars. Right? Number one, who you are. Just like, that's the first thing you said, you will ask them some questions. Very nice. So similarly, the first part is understanding the customer. Right? So if no two 50-year-olds have the same risk appetite, one loves to do paragliding, other one may not even enjoy sitting in a car. Right? So similarly, understanding their ability to take risks are very critical. So that's step one. Step two is understanding where their assets are, or resources are. Do they have any liabilities? Is there any payouts that is happening? What is the distribution of assets? Property, gold, debt products, and other stuff, including perhaps even cryptos. Three, cash flow. Clearly, if there are most people for whom they are earning, what is their income, what is their expenses, and also having some idea and ability to project the same for the future. Number four is very critical. So, if let's say we're going on a holiday, I come to you and say, Sundar, we're going on a holiday. Can you pack your bags? What would be your first question?
Where are we going? How long?
Perfect. Where are we going? First question. So similarly, the most important question, which is number four section of customization, is goals. And most people have some broad ideas if we are very young. But surely by the time they get to 30s or 40s, those ideas are a lot more crystallized. Their family has grown, children education, old age parents to take care of, their own travel plans, their retirement plans, marriage of children is important in India, and vagera vagera, charity, legacy. So goals becomes very important. Putting a number to it and then tying it all together becomes four important key pillars. And clearly, the fifth one we should also think about is the risk mitigations that they're taught about by way of insurance. So those are kind of 4 to 5 key pillars that we work on to ensure the risk customization and definitely not standardizing the product. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, Ramki, it does, and it gives a good structure to the whole process. Ramki, we at India First Life believe that most life events are bound to happen, and we need to plan for certainty rather than uncertainty. You think about it. Most people are bound to have dependents. Everyone is bound to retire. Now, we also know that, in this whole personal finance planning bit, there is no return without risk. In fact, there is no return without risk anywhere. Now, our listeners would like to know the risks associated with financial planning across all life stages. So would you like to throw some light to our listeners?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very important point you bring about, and in tying up with the conversation topic as well, right? So risks that are associated. So before we get into risk, I just want to highlight that there is a difference between volatility and risk. And most of the people I speak to in our clients always usually get this kind of mixed up, right? So what is volatility? Volatility is the change in price that happens either over a longer period, shorter period, but change in price. Versus risk is primarily the potential permanent loss, right? So risks that we want to talk about and volatility are inherent in all the products that one were to invest in, whether it is property, there is going to be price going up. Sometimes you even lose money in property. Similarly, in gold or equity, right? So what are the risks? There are clearly many risks in investing, but for our conversation, I'd like to focus on, say, just 3 to 4 risks. Number one, market risk. Now, what is market risk? If you were to be an equity investor, it's clearly the equity price movements, right? So September 11th attack happens, market crashes. 2008 market correction. Recently, COVID 2 years ago, and now Russia's invasion of Ukraine. All these events not planned for, they suddenly happen. You can clearly see equity price movements. And similarly, on the other side, significant increase in equity prices since COVID advent over the last 2 years also happens, right? So ups and downs. So in the same market risk for even bond investors is the interest rate movements. And as most retirees will tell you, the fixed deposit returns today are at abysmally low numbers, 4%, 3%, whereas just a few years ago, 10 years ago, they were in double digits, right? Even 5 years ago. So that's the interest rate movement. For people who travel internationally and or work abroad, you will see that there is a currency risk. Indian rupee continues to depreciate over the last 20, 30 years versus the US dollar. And so understanding that is another risk, again, similarly in the market risk. So there are many of these risks. So to give you my, if I were to give you my own example, in 2008, I moved jobs and I was moving from Europe to India because I had a personal emergency and wanted to be with my family here. And as I was moving here, my investments were mostly in equity, not all, but mostly in equity investments. So 2008, as I moved, the market's correct about 60%, not one, not two, but about 60%. My portfolio was actually down 60%. And so one of the things I did do was I didn't panic. At that time my son was just 1 year old. My portfolio, if you see the conversation we had earlier, right? One of the goals was that I would create a fund for my son's education. Now, just because the market corrected 60%, my son suddenly did not turn 18, right? He was still just 1 year old. So I didn't panic. Actually, to the contrary, I had done a lot of research on the assets I had invested in. I actually started adding to it. And next year, the portfolio actually did go up a little bit, but I still was not back to where I was. The year after, it fell. So by the end of 3 years, I was actually down significantly, still 20, 30% in that investment. But my son was still only 4 years old. And so I kept at it, I kept consistent at it, even with the market fall. And forget the next 5 years, but over the last, let's say, 12 to 14 years now, those investments have paid up significantly. So one of the key learning, even with an inherent market risk, is actually to remain consistent. Right? So that's the first risk. The second risk that most people do not really plan for, unfortunately, is liquidity risk. I'm sure you have seen a lot of people very rich financially in their assets and stuff, but when it comes to liquidity, they're very, very poor at it. A
Yeah.
good case in point is startup companies, right? Most startup companies don't take off because of lack of liquidity. It's not because their ideas are not ready, but they just burn out cash and they run out of it. I'll give you an example. The same 2008 crisis, I had another friend, a couple, similar age and prospect. In their case, they had put 100% of their funds into equities. And from 2001 to 2008, it was a fabulous run. They had done very, very well. But as 2008, the markets crashed, both of them lost their jobs. They were both investment bankers in a large firm in the US. They had quit their jobs, they couldn't find another job, and they had to move to their home country. What do you think they had to do? To make do, they had to exit out of their equity positions at that time because they didn't have liquidity. They didn't have emergency funds to take care of themselves. And therefore, as this liquidity crisis hit them, they had to exit those positions and actually, quite literally, with 50% gone, imagine your portfolio, right? You work hard to create a corpus, 50% is gone. You start again. Whereas contrast that with my own situation, similar misfortune befalls me. However, I did have an asset allocation or distribution of assets. So I didn't have to get out. And today, 14 years later, I actually got a significant leg up. Right? So that's the second biggest risk.
Interesting that you mentioned. I had a friend at the same time who went through a different kind of liquidity risk. Only
Interesting.
that the only difference was most of his investments were in property and not in equity.
Wow.
So the same
Wow.
liquidity problem.
Correct. Which, and again, being an opaque market and property not being listed that much, I can only imagine this. And if the market finds out that there's a seller in a market like that, then the price just falls even further. Wow. That's even more difficult.
Yeah,
Very interesting.
absolutely. Go ahead, Ramki.
No, that's a very interesting point. It's absolutely correct. So market risk, liquidity risk, two important risks to think about. Three, longevity risks. I think it's the most important risk that we also need to think about. Will your money outlive you? Living in India, in our generation or generations past, this was not that important a question for two reasons. Number one, you didn't live that long, right? We celebrate our 60th birthday as a big function and a festival. 80, oh my God, is a blessing. In most people, average age as India got independence was 35. It has moved up now to somewhere in the 60s, I believe. Still very low. But if you see the Western world, Japan and other parts, it's 100 plus. Imagine living 100 years and above, number one. And number two, our children in the past, like you and I, we are taking care of our parents, I'm sure. Our generation might be the last ones where we might do this, right? So, which means your children may not be the ones you depend upon. You need to have that child, which I look at as an investment, as your investments to take care of you as you live longer. So, these two issues, longevity and not having necessarily children to take care of us, not because they may not want to, you may also not want them to, which means it brings its own problem of will your money outlive you? Risk of longevity. Fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
And the last risk is an easy one, right? So let me ask you a question, Sundar. What is your favorite kind of cuisine?
Oh, I have a sweet tooth, and that cuts across cuisine.
Fantastic. What a lovely thing to have in the cuisine. So let's say I invite you home, Sundar, and then at lunchtime I serve you all kinds of sweets. Turkish baklavas to Indian variety of sweets to north to south, east and west, and just serve that. How would you feel?
Uh, I would go berserk, and I won't be able to. Marginal utility principle will set in.
Very quickly, right? By the time you get your fourth sweet, you're like, oh my God, what have you done? I'm never coming to your house again. So the fourth risk is exactly that, a concentration risk. So our investment decisions that I see with our people are almost always with their own biases towards investments. I love to touch and feel. I have heard investors say. So what do? They invest in things they can touch and see. Touch and see, so that becomes gold. See, therefore you have property. And then you wonder when they are very old, or when the extreme cases that we spoke about, 2008 crisis, which impacted your own friend in a property or otherwise, you wonder why money isn't working for me. It isn't working for you because we are concentrated with things that we like. Just like having only sweets is going to cause you a stomach upset, having too much of anything is only going to be bad. So I think that is a very important thing we need to really ask so that our biases don't cloud our investments. So in summary, very simply, Sundar, I think there are four key risks. There are many more. Obviously, there could be currency risk and everything else, but simply if you look at market risk, liquidity risk, longevity risk, and concentration risk would be some of the key ones that I would really. And the solution for this is quite simple. A review of asset allocation, which we can spend more time as we get into this conversation as well, will actually enable us to ensure that we are very nimble even as these risks come across in our lives.
Wonderful, Ramki. Great way to capture four key risks around personal financial planning. Now, when it comes to personal financial planning, I have family turning to me, whenever somebody starts earning. And there is one formula I learned a long time back from my personal financial planning guru. And he used to say that, replace the standard equation of savings is equal to income minus expenses to expenses is equal to income minus savings, which means plan for your savings before you plan for your expenses. Now, we spoke a bit about savings, but we didn't speak too much about income. What are your views about risks associated with incomes? Does everyone need an alternate income?
Oh yeah, how interesting. So if I just step back and just take a look at our own parents' generation, I always think they live their lives. Okay, actually, before that, let me jump in and ask you this question. So, how many jobs did Sundar, your father or mother, change in their life?
Oh, my dad started his career with a bank and retired from there.
Yeah. And if you look around, and the reason that I jumped in and saying, yeah, was that's exactly true for most of our parents, right, who have retired. Let's say in the 60s or 70s, the people who have retired now would have usually done what I call 20, 40, 20, right? 20 years, they would have studied, grad finished, if they did undergrad or PUC or anything else. And then they went to join work, they stayed there for 40 years, they all retired together. Yeah, does that resonate with you when you look
Yeah,
around your elders as well? And then as
absolutely.
they,
Several of them.
yeah,
Several of
several
them.
of, correct. And then they would retire for the next 20 years, figuring out what they wanted to do. That was, let's say, the previous generation. Now, if you exclude us and go down to Gen Z, what I find in my coaching business is, and I interact with a lot of the youngsters, is that you see that they're very, let's say, to use the word very loosely, transactional. What do I mean? They would come in, they'll pick up a skill, do a job, let's say for 2.5 years, or 1.5 years, and say, hey, I'm going to work for a year and a half, save enough money, go on a, let's say, 6 months backpacking in South America, or 3 months learning Spanish while I backpack around Europe, or something like that, right? I mean, so we see that also happening with that. Our generation are somewhere right in the middle, right? And so this life expectation shift also means, I think there are two important tenets that come about that can actually help both the previous and ours and the next generation, right? To answer your question, what happens to income sustenance? Number two, how does everyone need an alternate income? Okay. So how do I think about it? First point that I think is we almost in our situation think about money. So when I ask my clients, what do you think about money? They immediately think about Lakshmi or someone that they need to pray to. So it's only something that we hold ourselves in reverence, or other emotion that comes about is fear or greed. I somehow think about our money as another member in our family who's working for us. Why should it only be you, your wife who works for the family, or your children tomorrow when they grow up? Why can't money be also another member that works? So we need to really start asking the question, is my money working for me? Or is the money like an elephant sitting at home? You're feeding it. And that feeding is actually inflation, right? As expenses keep growing, if your money is actually not working, it's an elephant sitting in your house. So we have to ask ourselves this question. Number one, that's the first point. Number two is important thing that is happening in a world that is changing so quickly, right? When I graduated from my college times to the mid 90s to finishing my CA, and when I came to the workplace, 40% of the skills required were not available when I studied. And I can only imagine that your daughter who is now 20 getting into workplace, how quickly that life must be changing. Which means we constantly need to upskill and reskill. If you're not upskilling and reskilling ourselves, then we are going to be in trouble because the world is changing constantly, right? So, in my own example, it's not something that you really planned for at 20 to say, I will be a wealth advisor. That wasn't very clear at that time. But what I did find out was I slowly started veering towards things that I was very good at. The concept of ikigai, where something that I'm very good at, I figured out that I was a good coach, both leadership skills and in my ability to manage money. And second part of it, I was very, very passionate and curious about it. And as I veered toward it, the third circle in ikigai, which is that people were ready to pay for these skill sets, came about. So I'm absolutely an advisor that people should really think about these skills as they trend towards it. So these two things, it's one way to do. Does your money work for you? And are you really upskilling? Can usually take care of these rapid changes that's happening.
Super, Ramki. That gives very, very good direction to the income risk, that we talked about. Let's go ahead. And in the realm of personal financial planning, a very, very important aspect is a dependent or dependence. Now, when you look at a life cycle of any of us, right, changes happen. Income grows, peaks, and then probably stops. And like how you said, if you make your money work for you, probably continues. Dependents grow, they also peak and probably recede. Okay, and then they become independent. Expenses, which is the third part of the equation I mentioned earlier, does not, however, stop growing. It only
Yeah,
probably stagnates or increases. And now, how do we address the needs of dependents? If you could give some tips around that.
sure. I think it's a very valid point. Expenses keeps growing. Our income earning period, to your point, whichever, whether you are the older generation or ours or the next, is probably also limited, probably getting extended, but still very limited. And it peaks and actually starts dropping off, right? So the way I think about this is probably it's a good time for me to just talk about as life cycle changes. I think there are 3 to 5 key tenets of financial planning or life that one should look at. So number one is the principle of 20-50-30. Have you heard of this, Sundar?
Yeah, kind of, but I'll let it come from the horse's mouth.
Thank you. So that's fundamentally most people at the younger life cycle. A person who starts in his 20 or her 20s are usually ones who just usually end up spending the most. Even as your own example of 100 rupees to 200 to 300, how within the first week it was gone, right? So in this case, the principle of 20-50-30 is all about first paying oneself, which is to put away money for your future. So in your case, example of 100 rupees, if we were to take away 20 rupees and save it, okay? Then the next 50 is what are my needs? What are the critical expenses that one should spend for? So there is electricity of the house rent, the food, and everything else. The last 30, which we come to, is the wants. And if you really think about an early 20s or 30s, we are usually going after the wants first. Hey, I want the iPhone, or I want the next best thing, or I want to travel this. Those wants are usually should only be put aside after you finish with your 20, 50, 30. What I have found in my own life is with this example is this becomes a habit. If we are able to put away 20 rupees when my income was only 100 or 10,000 or 1 lakh, whatever that be, imagine what we are able to do when our income grows in our 30s and 40s. Your ability to put away the 20% actually grows to 30 to 40. So that's the power of that habit. So 20, 50, 30. So pay yourself first. The second financial rule, which is very, very critical in any life cycle, is having an emergency fund. What should that emergency fund be? Again, is a customization issue, but very simple rule of thumb. Can you please put aside 6 months? Should it be expense or income? If you can put aside your income for 6 months, put aside 6 months of expense, please have. How does that help? A classic, a very sad example in this one is a story of a couple who was saving money for their child's education. The child education, he was going to study in Canada. Money was set aside, everything happens, and COVID strikes the family. The family did not have health insurance. The family enough adequate health insurance. The family did not have enough emergency fund. What do you do? If you have to save a life, you put away the education. So they took the money from that education fund and took care of the health expenses. The parents did well, they survived, but the son is not able to go for education. So these are the kind of stuff that happens because you've not really planned for an emergency fund. So that's the second part, right? Third part, very critically across life cycles, is looking at insurance. Do you? Insurance is not something that you just take and shut it. your organization does a great job about it. I'm sure you can add more to this. Is looking at adequacy of insurance at various life stages as it changes, whether it is health or life, is very, very, very important. Right? In this own example I gave of emergency, if the health insurance is adequate, then the person did not need to break and interrupt the child's education. Correct?
Yeah.
So that's the third part. And the fourth financial tenet I also think about is asset allocation. Right? So, we did a Google search of it. I'm sure you will get like 1+ million words on it. But very simply, an asset allocation is actually just looking at various asset classes. Hey, is it gold? Is it property? Is it equities? Is it debt? And ensuring that they are appropriate for your life stage. And this is where a financial advisor, a mutual fund distributor, or anyone else in there, a proper trusted advisor's opinion can really help. There are experts in this role. So I would urge people who are not able to do this on their own to reach out and ask for help. And in India, financial inclusion and financial advisory is actually a very nascent one, and it is very rarely picking up. And a pet peeve of mine here, if I may add here, is how very little women are involved in these conversations. I take a side track, but recently I was called to talk to about 200 plus women on Women's Day to help them financial advice. And the frustrating point which I spoke first was, again, I'm here as a man talking to women, telling them what to do. And I'm hoping through our conversations, more women take an active role in managing their finances. And asset allocation conversations, when we call our clients, we insist that the spouse, whether it is the earning member or not, should turn up for these conversations. And many a times I find hesitation in women, and I would urge all our women listeners to please take a very active role. It is beneficial for the family. Studies after studies show that when women get involved in managing the assets, the portfolio generates higher return. Forget the risks that are associated with it, which are plenty when women do not get involved. So again, so I take a side step, but I would urge all women to actively start getting involved in it. So the fourth point is asset allocation. And the last one is actually getting ease on very properly is to understand where the investments are. And that's one of the reasons why women need to be involved in it. When does all your accounts have nominees? At various stages, it's an annual cleanup, just like you would clean your house regularly during Diwali or other functions or Eid or Christmas, you would paint your house. Would you not take half an hour, half a day if required to review your investments? Do you have nominees? Is your health insurance? Do you have critical cover? Is your term insurance or life insurance adequate? Where are all the assets? We find year after year, banks they are writing back money because thousands of crores are not even being accessed because the family members are not aware. So in my own case, my wife and I travel quite a bit, and we have 3 very young children. The oldest one is just 15. So we have made a list of all assets and given access to that as a password to 2 other family members. In case something were to happen to us, that they were able to access it. It's not just about writing a will. It'll be great if people were to write it, but otherwise, at least having a list, both digital and financial assets. So these are kind of 5 tenets. I'm going to pause if you had any questions to elaborate on this, Sundar.
No questions, Ramki. It's interesting that you mention that 5 tenets that you talked about cuts across gender, and the very nice and beautiful way you put that across. I'll progress further, Ramki, and let's talk about how this works out across life stages, right? Let's talk a bit about children and their ambition, right? Now, children ambition, is you talked about change as a constant, and now this is a variable. This changes not every year. It probably changes every month, depending upon what is the flavor of the season.
Very true.
Uh, so in light of all of that, you can't have a control over aspirations and ambition. Um, how do these five tenets, or how does asset allocation, for example, cut across and yet be able to meet that financial goal?
I mean, I recently saw your advertisement as well from your companies. It's a beautiful tagline that it closes with, if I got it right, was about the and. The choice the parent has to make is not about education or sports or music or other aspirations, but it's about the and. That's a beautiful advertisement that you guys had. So, if a child's dream constantly shifts, and having three children and having two of yours, you can relate to it. One day my child wants to be a chef. Recently, he went to Sriharikota, and now he wants to be a space astronaut, or actually build houses in Mars. So these things are constantly shifting as the winds change. So if that is the variable that you beautifully put, then surely our financial asset allocations should also adapt to it, right? Otherwise, we're not really prepared for these changes. So the way I think about it are very simple. We need to really start thinking about the previous topic, which I mentioned, point number 4 of your asset allocation at various stages of your life. And so as I said, when you're early, when you're younger, and let's say if I take a step back before the child is born, the individual, both male and female, should have a higher exposure to the more, let's say, higher returning, higher volatile asset class. So in that case, it's about equities. After holding emergency reserves, holding about even 80% or 90, or whatever the percentage in equities can help, because you're still very young and you can take the volatility in your stream. As the cycle progresses, the lady or the man gets married. They're now a couple. Now starting to think about introducing some stability. Both are earning, but still having a higher risk of volatile assets can continue. Perhaps starting to think about life insurance comes into play at that time, because after all, now you do have one more person with you. For sure, health insurance should be consistent even when they are an individual, right? Now, as they then grow and the child is born, then they start, like in your own example, your initial one you mentioned about thinking about a house, thinking about providing for their education. Now you start introducing other asset classes into it, whether it is more debt products, fixed deposits, or annuity returning products, and or introducing gold or investing in other asset classes. Right? Clearly, now your pizza pie is a little bit more distinct than it was in the beginning. And as you grow older again, the ability or the need for you to take higher risk also significantly diminishes. There may not be a need to be in large numbers in volatile asset classes. So then you prune that to bring it down to your goals and needs. So just like the changes of an individual happens, as the life stages also change, I think it's important for the individual couple to adapt their asset allocation to meet their needs. And this also ties in very well to the example I gave earlier in 2008 when the crash happened. If I did not have a proper asset allocation, and I was also shifting home, you saw how I was able to adapt to that situation. Whereas my own friend, or the example of your friend, they were not able to adapt to it because they were concentrated and therefore not able to realize the benefits. So I would again here, the question that comes about is, oh, this sounds a little complicated. Actually, it isn't. And again, if it is complicated, please seek the advice of an expert in these. There are enough and more of us who can help people walk this through. And having a principled process of review, even once a year, can help our house tidy this. So, in summary, one, investing is not about one asset class. Don't think about investing as the next fad. Today it's crypto, yesterday it was property, day before yesterday it's others. It's not one or the other. Just like your ad beautifully brings it out. It's about one and the other to ensure that, right? That's number one. Number two is about labels. Oh, I'm a conservative investor. I'm a moderate investor, I'm an aggressive investor. These labels are not permanent. They are labels that are attached to the phase of your life. And they will change. The same person who was ready to take higher risk earlier should and would not take the same risk today. I used to enjoy roller coasters a lot in my 20s. Today, my kids think I'm a chicken. I wouldn't do too many of them as I did when I was younger. So is it true for your portfolio too? If it doesn't need to be volatile or risky, the labels also need to shift and adapt to it. So those are kind of two or three themes that should change and enable our goals to be met.
Great, Ramki. Great way you spoke about how we can use the principle of and. Uh, let's speak about another important stage of life, which is retirement.
Mm.
Everyone has to retire, right? And we cannot have what in our mythology we have an Akshaya Patra, which would keep feeding us and would never stop. How do you think one should plan for retirement?
Yeah, so I think as I was saying even earlier, this is where the tortoise comes to play. So the first step of peaceful retirement is to ask the question, will my money outlive me? Not when you're 50, not when you're 60, but if we can start at 20, even earlier, and then apply those five financial tenets that we spoke about earlier, right at that juncture onwards and create that habit. So the first point is start early. Second point, building a good relationship with money. There's a beautiful book called The Psychology of Money, where you need to start creating the habit of investing, and habits become very critical. In our lives, like a toothbrush is right next to our wash basin. When you wake up in the morning, you're not looking for it. Imagine if in our households we were to hide the toothbrushes and toothpaste. You know, Forget our children, even you and I wouldn't brush our teeth that regularly, right? We brush regularly because that is a habit. We wake up first thing in the morning, the toothbrush is there. Similarly, our investing habits need to be practiced and sharpened. This is a knife that needs to be sharpened right from our young age. And if that is consistent, and as life throws its own googlies, and there is a storm, or there is an unexpected event, somebody falling sick, or an external event like another country attacking another country, or a COVID, you're prepared. So the second point I always mention is to have this. And number three is what we spoke about earlier as well, which is the asset allocation. It's being clear about different life stages requiring us to adapt to that asset allocation. Like, so again, an example here, in our vacation thing, Sundar, you asked me where we are going. If I were to tell you we were going to Maldives for a holiday, or Andamans for a holiday, your what dress would you bring for that, Sundar?
Andamans would bring some swimwear.
Somewhere, correct? You would not bring your ski and your winter clothing, correct? However, if I told you we were going to Uttarakhand in October, November, or Switzerland because we had saved money for that goal, and we were able to take that money out and go on a holiday to Switzerland. Oh wow! In December, what clothing would you have?
The first thing would be thermals.
There you go. Especially considering we come from the warmer parts of India. So, absolutely. So our clothing is adapted to the environment. Similarly, our assets should be adapted to a life stages that we stay in. It's that simple. So those are three things. Retirement planning should start early. And the fourth point is clearly and absolutely thinking about the critical part of insurance that I keep bringing about everywhere. Risk mitigation should start very early. So I'll give you an example. People do not take their own health insurances because they say my company provides it. I know of individual cases where they were in between jobs, they quit, and they didn't start because there were some requirements and some checkups, and there was a serious illness/accident in the middle. A simple gap like that threw their plans away. Not having adequate life insurances. And there's enough and more examples I'm sure you would have seen, Sundar, about life insurances being inadequate that throws away because they think I'm healthy. So it's about risk mitigation, which is the important aspect as well here that we should think about. So those are four tenets that I would again bring about our people. Start early. Please create a habit of being consistent with your investment. Three, be with your changing life, ensure asset allocation reflects it, review it. Number four, are you taking care of your risks?
Some very good aspects that you have brought about, Ramki. I'm taking away three out of our conversation. Consistency is king. Customization is key. Insurance is hygiene. So those three are some interesting ones which I'm taking away. You'll make financial decisions, I believe, for rest of your life. And all of our listeners will do that. Sometimes you can anticipate these judgments and plan properly. Other times, life happens, and you're forced to make a rush decision.
Correct.
Personal financial planning, should most certainly be adaptable enough to respond to unanticipated events and unknown risks. So, your personal circumstances will influence your financial thinking, and the state of the economy will influence your financial decisions. Hence, we all have to be financially prepared for each stage in life and manage all risks. And, you've beautifully brought that about through your five tenets, which you talked about earlier. On that note, Ramki, would you want to share some closing remarks?
I thank you, Sundar. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation with you. I hope the listeners also take away that if we start early, if we're consistent, and we can enjoy the long ride that life offers. The purpose of this conversation is actually so that we don't have to worry about money. Money should not be a concern for us. That we should be able to do things we want to do while money works for us. And this applies both for men and women. So my only big success would be if, as I said earlier as well, if more people and especially more women start taking an active role in this. Summarize those 3 points as well, Sundar. So thanks for that, and thank you.
Ramkey Ananthakrishnan, thank you so much for taking time to share your valuable insights with us. This was an excellent discussion, and I'm confident that our listeners benefited greatly from it. Let us know what you think about today's episode and stay tuned for the next. Signing off, Sunder Natarajan.